Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Reinsurance Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose. And we have a special guest with us here today as well. So welcome, Mark Geoghegan, the man who needs no introduction.
Well, I don't know, maybe you can, you need to say how to spell my name, which I've spent my whole life doing, how to spell the surname. But otherwise, no, you're probably right. If they're regular podcast listeners, one would only hope that they had already discovered the Voice of Insurance podcast over the last
You're the
years.
pioneer in this space. We were trying to do the reinsurance sector because you've sort of so largely captured the broad insurance market. So you've sort of set the standard for us.
Yeah, but you have a job to do. This is all I do. I don't do anything else apart from this. Whereas you actually have to build a reinsurance placing platform with all this data and all this clever stuff. Because, I had you on the show about this time last year. So, I've hats off to you that you find any time to do this on top of your day job. So
our mere association with you rocketed us into reinsurance fame. So
well, good. Well, I mean that's what it's for. Yeah. I mean it's a small universe, and if you get 1,000 people listen to it, it's meaningful. I used to fret about it was 1,000. That doesn't sound like very much in the grand scheme of things, but actually I used to think, well, that's 2 Willis building auditoriums full. And we never quite had it full when I was back at the Insurance Society. We would do events there. You could occasionally get 475 or something in there with standing room at the back, that kind of thing. But it's only when you think of it that way, you think, actually, that's not bad. Yeah. That's not bad. If it's reaching the right people, that's the thing. Because you're never going to download a reinsurance podcast by accident, are you? And go, well, if you did, you go, well, the hell's that? I'm deleting that,
Yeah.
Oh, you say that. The popularity of the reinsurance podcast amongst novices has surprised us, I think.
When you get some stats and it says, you're number one business podcast in Madagascar, like for 3 minutes. So, I don't know, because one person downloaded it or something. I don't know.
The thing that astonished me, I think, when we looked at the space, we were like, what should we call the podcast? How are we going to go about this? And there was no reinsurance specific podcast, and we thought, great, we'll go for that space. And when you actually searched for reinsurance, more songs came up than podcast episodes. And I was like, who's naming their songs reinsurance? like what piece of music has been inspired by reinsurance? But
God, no, I don't know. I'm just thinking of it's made me think of there are quite a lot of people in the insurance industry who do music on the side, people like John Kavanagh, Capital. You have to. I'll send you for the notes. I'll send you a list of people that I have discovered over the years that do a bit of music on the side.
Who's the one who does the rapping?
Recently moved as well. Aon's ex-head of cyber. Analytics, John Lau.
Yeah.
There used to be a runoff band as well, so which is obviously that sort of reinsurance, because obviously runoff uses a lot of reinsurance as a way of transacting the business. So they used to do a band, and at one of those big events. Well, I suppose they have really, really big events, but Runoff has its own kind of versions of Monte Carlo and Rims, etc. They have events, set piece events. There's one down in Brighton, or it used to be in Norwich, and then there's one over in New Jersey every year that they go to. And they would get together and have a big party, and then there was a Runoff band was formed that would play to the Runoff community.
There we are. I mean, I do have in my claim to fame, I have played the piano at a Christmas party in the industry before, which was quite funny. So I was working for the syndicate called Acapella. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the budget approved to get an acapella group to come and sing. So I found myself having to play instead. And hilariously, it was held in the Grocers Hall in the London Market. And they had it's a beautiful grand piano there. And the thing about grand pianos is, in order to get to the music stand, because I brought some Christmas music with me because it was going to be a Christmas party, you have to open the lid of the piano. But unfortunately, being the Grocers Hall and having all sorts of strange ornaments in it, there was a solid silver baby bath on top of the piano that meant you couldn't actually lift up the lid at all, and therefore couldn't put up a music stand, so therefore couldn't use any music. So the audience was entreated to all sorts of random things that I could loosely remember how to play, but nothing really Christmassy.
Yeah.
So it's like sort of a cappella, but
sort of a cappella.
Yeah, sort of like. No, what would you say? What's the word? Not a cappella, but the
improvised
ad lib rather than a cappella. Yeah. That's it. Yes, there we go.
I mean, the industry
rebrand of that syndicate following that day.
Yes, what's happened to a cappella?
Sadly, RIP. I think they were one of the casualties of that new group of syndicates that I think didn't quite hit the scale they wanted to. We did an analysis on this a long time ago.
Bad timing as well. Bad, right in the middle of a soft market.
Yeah.
And no, but I suppose you can play in the Runoff band now. You definitely qualify.
Yeah. It's on the CV. But the industry it's an incredibly eccentric group, right? Especially when you get into sort of the leadership. There's a lot of really big personalities. From your time, you've sort of seen and spoken to sort of everyone who matters throughout your career at The Insider. Like, who are sort of the personalities that stand out as like the biggest personalities in the space? 'Cause I think this industry is rife with them.
Well, they all are. They all are. I think reinsurance brokers are sort of right near the top of that, though. And actually, I've just done a podcast with James Kent, and I'd say the legacy Willis Re was completely full of interesting. I think on the podcast, he didn't mind me saying, I think you sort of had a maverick characteristic about you in Willis Re, because they were big enough to matter, and obviously being the third biggest and being sort of everywhere and pitching on almost everything, and up against Aon and Guy Carpenter every day of the week. But at the same time, they were sort of like an independent republic of their own thing. But then we had people, lots of characters within, certainly 15 years ago, well, after KRW, facultative was sort of really hot. Facultative reinsurance was a very hot ticket at the time, and there was lots of interesting stories around that, and there's some massive personalities in that.
Yeah.
And people like Elliot Richardson, they were huge personalities. And yes, I'd love to get Elliot on the show, because he's slightly lower profile now. He's now within the Howden firmament. But people like that. It was always the brokers. If you're ever organising a round table, you need to have a couple of brokers. We need more than one. Broker will keep everyone else honest, but if you have two brokers, they'll compete with each other. It's obviously not from the same broker. And then that means that they will be almost talking over each other, and you get a fantastic, you get a really good vibe. Suddenly it's like the whole thing's alive now, and everyone has to talk.
We have, I guess, two ex-brokers with us today. I mean, it'd be great to hear a bit about your background, Mark. They've all heard you.
Well, let's go for the full house. It's a trio of ex-brokers. Yeah. So I was a graduate. I did Spanish at university, and I graduated. I hadn't really thought about career at all. It's like most people who end up in insurance, because they didn't have a career plan. But I had a plan that I wanted to have a bilingual job. Went to the careers department, and they said, "Oh, well, there's a couple going in something called reinsurance. Go down there." And then actually, that September I got the job, and I was wandering down Lime Street the first couple of days on the job, and somebody else on my course had got that other job that was available. So, there was a big demand for language speakers, and I was working with the London office of the biggest Spanish insurance broker, which had its own small Lloyd's broker. So I got a really good. It was nice because it was the biggest broker in Spain, so we had to service everything that was weird and wonderful. They had a service ethic to say, well, no one else will quote on this, but we will. And it meant that I had to, there were only 3 or 4 placing brokers. You got all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. There were things that London market was particularly strong at, so the classic sort of BBB, and the nasty liability classes tend to be sort of people who remove asbestos or PCB, horrible sort of chemicals, and store them in a salt mine somewhere, that kind of thing. And then some of the really big liability programs, so the big electricity utilities, that kind of thing. So we had things that kind of paid for the bread and butter of the business, but the rest of it was just utterly mad. So contingency, sort of lack of snow cover for a World Cup skiing event in the Sierra Nevada. It could be almost anything that just didn't fit. Then we get sent it. So it's half the time you go and get a quote and then hope that you didn't get a firm order, because you wouldn't really know how to place it. It's like, I don't know. I know who the leader is because I just asked someone randomly in Lime Street, but how will I place this if we ever get a firm order? Is this a good quote? I don't know. But anyway, it was a lot of the that kind of ethic was servicing. Well, I had a really good grounding in that. So, I think if I'd been at a big place, I would have got a bit bored, getting sort of siloed into being a D&O broker or being this or that. We did everything. But I found it a bit boring. I like doing new things. And then the trouble with reinsurance broking, or any kind of insurance, is mostly kind of wholesale insurance broking or some reinsurance broking, was that once you renew it, then for me, it's like being an estate agent. It has to sell the same house every year. And it's like, you're just arguing about money. You didn't pay this claim. You haven't paid your premiums on time. It's sort of stuff that I'm not really that good at. I liked the intellectual challenge of trying to solve a really difficult problem, like relegation insurance for Atletico Madrid or something like that. It's really interesting. It's like, wow, I never even knew that was possible. And, that's cool. But if you renewed it, it suddenly becomes quite boring.
Yeah.
And so unless you're kind of really motivated about maximizing your income,
Yep.
for me, it was never really about that. Then I drifted off.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. The weird and wonderful is when you first come into the space, like it's addicting. It's so wild, and everything is a discovery process and needs to be built from the ground up. But then you're right, as it sort of moves into just renewing and rinsing and repeat, a lot of times the changes are really minor. It's like, oh, we're gonna buy a little bit more cover this year. We're gonna move the deductible a little bit, or you sort of, once you've solved it the first time, the excitement can sort of drift away. And then again, as you said, if you're really into the numbers, and that's where maximizing income, as you said, is the something that really interests you. It's a different audience versus that initial problem-solving broker. And
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and how's it with you with Superseed then? You're going to suddenly get bored of it. Once you've solved it, you're going, and it's just renewals and just subscription prices and people moaning about service levels and whatever.
There was I was talking to an early employee at Intercom yesterday, and he was sort of saying that for the first 6 years of the Intercom roadmap, it was like there was so much demand for all these additional things that they just had to sort of slowly just put them in line and chip away at them, and there's so much pull from the market for what they were doing. And I think there's a very similar feeling for us where we have so much to do that it's like, we'll do that thing for now, and then that thing is moving, and we'll chip away and add the next thing, and we'll chip away. And so there's a huge amount of pull, and our customers sort of building us our backlog and our priority roadmap. So,
well, I remember on the podcast I went through all the skeptical questions I thought I had to ask, and you answered all of them. Because it's what you're trying to do is really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So, hats off to you, and I hope you succeed. Actually, because it's a net good for everybody. The point is that someone has to do this, because there's no point having 4, 5 main reinsurance brokers all with their own systems and spending millions on something. It's like you and I going and spending millions on our own version of Excel because we don't quite like Microsoft's version. I mean, come on, it's like, just deal with it, because it's perfectly good for what you need it to do, to add up a load of stuff and do your accounts. It's so
great to hear.
I think you should do it. No, I'm really in favour of it, because it's just a net benefit for the reinsurance industry.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard to get people to do it, and I think that's always it's sometimes it's almost the ego of or the sort of the illusion that there's some kind of comparative advantage, and there really isn't. And the industry will get there in the end, I think. Mm-hmm. But the trouble is, can you stay solvent long enough? But when they finally come around to the idea in 15 years' time, it's like, well, hang on, we didn't get, I hope you've got other ways of getting income while you're waiting for them to all hit that light bulb moment.
Yeah, we're chipping away and making good progress. But you're right. We've seen the industry trying to do it for a number of years, and the very candid conversation we had back on your podcast sort of gave a lot of insight into the process by which we thought through what next looks like, what we're starting with and why, and how we move through that process. Because, if you try to start with everything at once, it doesn't work, because you're inevitably going to miss a couple of things or could be slightly off on something you build. So it has to be very ruthless around what are we going to respond to, what are we going to build first, get momentum and traction there, and then slowly chip away and evolve.
Yeah, and I think to your point around what do we do whilst we wait for the industry to converge, we've been very lucky, I think, to find a very willing audience of cedants who want to get stuck in the meantime, who also want a bit more than they're getting at the moment in terms of feedback on the placement as it's happening, etc. So whilst obviously what we're all gunning towards is this single place where deals are happening, I loved a moment ago you actually used our secret internal slogan, deal with it, for what you should do with Superseed's reinsurance platform. But in the meantime as well, we're now having just ever more cedants coming to us to use the digital submission pack preparation tools that we have, and they're starting to feed those to their brokers, and the brokers are then going, oh, this is nice. Look at all this data that's been prepared brilliantly and is now ready for us to pass on to our markets a lot more quickly. So we're not, the janitors of the reinsurance market, but instead we're actually doing valuable stuff. Yeah. And with that, I think they're then getting a lot more easily interested in and seeing a lot more quickly what the benefits could be of doing their whole deal-making process with this kind of technology. So the cedants are really helping push forward the vision there.
That's really good. That's really good. But God, there's a lot of cedants, and that's global. That's distribution. You know,
It's a big, it's a big market. The other thing I think, going back to your earlier point, that we're excited about that is if we take that sort of janitorial work off the broker's plate, a bunch of these brokers now can say, well, the data's already cleansed and in place. Now we have much more time to sort of tuck into all manner of different structures. You're looking at the emergence of new program types and cascading and top and drop and all manner of interconnected sort of towers, and if you give the brokers more time to sort of, data's done day one, and now we've got a few weeks to really interrogate a bunch of different options, and you're getting that creativity back from the brokers in a way that previously was, we spent the first 2 months cleansing the data that's been dumped over to us and then slapping it onto the tower that was expiring. And now we're going, okay, so the data's in place. We can begin to really understand the client's objectives and hopefully get that broker audience much more engaged around what else can you do now if we get the data done for you up front.
Because it's so boring.
Yeah.
I remember, it's just just getting a whole load of stuff and saying, is this net, or is this from the ground up, or is this net of the deductibles? And if it's net of the deductibles, what were the deductibles? Yeah. Because it doesn't say anything, literally, and you're just spending weeks and back in those days, it was faxes, and it was just appalling, So yes, I think you're light years ahead. But I think that's a really, really good. If you're going to remove pain points for the brokers, and they're more likely to use it, aren't they? I mean, that's the way to go.
Yeah, and I guess while we're on the topic of brokers, Cordy has set us an analogy battle to tackle during this episode. Given the expertise in the room, I don't know, Jared, if you want to go first, and then we'll work round.
Yeah.
But what is a broker?
So the analogy battle was to describe a reinsurance broker, but without sort of using all the basic industry sort of jargon that we normally use. The analogy that I've sort of landed on was like a construction company / business. So hear me out. So there's a couple different types. The one is, we're building a bunch of similar homes. You can pick one of these 3 floor plans, and based on your selection of minor furnishing changes, this will be the price of this house. Pretty basic, pretty rinse and repeat, not overly exciting. And for a big chunk of basic risks, that makes sense. And the broker's job is to just kind of fill those deals up. But the other audience, or the other sort of group there, is ones that work with very sort of needy, complex buyers. And the first point you start with is like, what do you want to achieve? What are we trying to do here? And you sort of sit down with a blank piece of paper and you look at kind of, how big is their family? Where do you want to live? What geography do you want? Access to the mountains or to the, ocean or whatever it might be. And you start from scratch and then kind of work through, and you present a couple different design options and you get feedback, and the whole thing is bespoke. And I think that sort of client centricity, the idea of it being purely bespoke from scratch and by design, and then once it's built, then as you said earlier, Mark, it becomes someone has to buy this house next, right? So I'm moving in the house. That whole vision, that whole dream of the first purchase is kind of done now. You're just trying to offload this to a new buyer. But the process of building it the first time, and then you have all these steps of sourcing in the marble from different countries if it's fancy, all those things that have to, filling up the capacity. So that was kind of the one I landed on. But we'll hand over to you, sir, to...
Oh, okay. Well... I suppose, do I have an unfair advantage having had to write editorials for 15, 17 years? And obviously, I've had to come up with analogies, and I'm sure I did come up with one. And maybe it's a reflection of having worked at the biggest broker in Spain. Was mine as a Catholic priest.
Okay.
So you confess. The cedant can tell you everything, tell you things that they wouldn't tell a direct broker, ever. Things that they've done wrong. And of course, the broker can listen and then say, and then actually absolve all these sins. So this is more in the sense of mistakes. It's like, I've just underwritten something, I've gone over the line. Mm-hmm. Oh, don't worry, we can get some fact. Well, we can do something about that. Or I didn't know it had a railway in it, and railways are excluded. Maybe we've got a special acceptance here. Maybe we've got, again, facultative reinsurance. I didn't know it had a small guns manufacturer. It's like, how didn't you know that, for God's sake? And do they export to the US? It's like, terror, shock, horror. Yes, they do. Of course they export to the US, the biggest gun market in the world. Yeah. It's like, yeah, but they're only small handguns. It's like, yeah, but that don't even go there. Yeah. All that kind of stuff. And or I remember, in Spain, everything shuts down for the whole of August, and coming back on the 3rd of September, and a submission to a binder or something that we had, and it's like, hey, Paco, there's something about this submission. It's fine, but it's like the inception date's the 2nd of August. I said, yeah. Obviously, it happened while I was on holiday. I forgot about it. I've been at the beach for a month. It's like, can you do something about it? It was like, yeah, okay, we can see, let's see about, subject to no known and reported losses. Well, actually, there was a loss, a small one. It's like, okay. So it's like, things that you would never tell anybody.
Yep.
You wouldn't tell your partner.
Yeah.
But you can tell them to a reinsurance broker, and the reinsurance broker often can help and do something about it. And so I was thinking more from sort of taking away sins.
Yeah,
That's brilliant.
that is very good. All right, Ben, you're up.
How do I compete with that? So for me, the ever-present analogy in the back of my mind is my upcoming wedding in a few months. So I see the broker as a bit like a wedding planner. Somebody who's there to help you with something that you only hopefully do once. You're organising this big wedding for yourself. You haven't really got that direct experience of doing this over and over again, whereas your wedding planner does this literally all the time. So if you go to your wedding planner and you say, you know what, I really want to come in riding an elephant, the wedding planner's got the wisdom to say, are you sure? Because I've seen a couple of weddings where they've tried that, and let me just tell you, the elephant ate the cake. And 2 of the bridesmaids. You might not want to go down that route.
Well, I'm of the generation where it was the greatest. I'm sure it's on YouTube, but see the famous clip of the baby elephant running rampage on Blue Peter, which is children's TV show in BBC TV studios, and it just goes completely crazy and sort of obviously answers the call of nature on the floor. The presenter ends up slipping up in it, and it's just unbelievable. I'm sure it's still classic. It's still worth Googling it.
We'll also put this in the clip in the notes.
It's still black. It's black and white, but it's absolutely golden.
That's brilliant. We should put this on the front page of a broker's website somewhere. Avoid mishaps like this. Get a broker you can trust.
Well, no, I think you're pretty good though on yours because. Again, obviously, mine was just the negative side of things. It's taking away problems and problem solving. But of course, it's the positive side. And your thing is like, I want to build this palace. And it's you, again, another kind of, I want to build something idealistically wonderful. Yeah. And then the reinsurance broker's got to come with a realism, say, within the budget you've got, you're not going to do that. And you're not going to no one's going to take away your explosives exclusion because what do you really know about them? Yeah. And they're treated exclusion for a really good reason. Yeah. In guns manufacturers and other stuff. So it's that dose of realism, but the same, but also enough optimism to help the client fulfill that vision to say, you want to do this, right? Great. You want to get into this new line. We're going to get the reinsurance support to help you to do that and to help get some of the expertise that you can buy in from the reinsurance world.
Yeah, but I think you touched as well on like the underlying component of trust that's so important in the industry is when you look at how it evolves, the fact that the broker is that sort of very trusted party that you can sort of take everything you're trying to do to, and then they present similar in a lot of ways to also like the legal profession where they'll help you craft the narrative, take it to market, sell it in its best light. This book is performing terribly and it's getting worse, but the broker will help you craft the message around why that isn't such a big deal. And it's a short term, and this sort of alignment with whatever the client's doing is part of the broker's job to help curate and present that narrative onwards, I think is sort of what drives that trust and the depth of those relationships throughout the industry. So
yeah, and brokers and reinsurance brokers can do that so much better now. Yeah. Before, it was all slightly on a wing and a prayer, and now you've got the data, you can actually do it. And obviously, if they're using your system, it can make it even easier. Yeah. But yeah, I reconnected with the industry. I went off to become a journalist, and then in 2005, 2006, I came back as an editor of a magazine. Suddenly, I was going to Monte Carlo, and as a reinsurance broker, very junior, I didn't go to Monte Carlo because it wasn't important enough. Suddenly, as an editor of a magazine, of course, you have to go to Monte Carlo, and you're meeting all sorts of people. And I was meeting former colleagues of mine who are now, who were working in Spain, who were at Monte Carlo they were running the Spanish operations, and and they said, well, Mark, you wouldn't even recognize what it was like, what the place is now, even 7 years after I'd left the industry. It said, I've got all these actuaries now. I've got these people. My clients love it. They're always saying, what if I do this? What if I increase my retention to 100 million? What if I do that? What if I exclude this? And it's like, wow, and they love it. And so they're never going to leave me because literally I've got this free consultancy all year round. And then, I do a transaction at the end of the year, but literally the amount of permutations and combinations I'm giving them all the time and new ideas. I'm permanently a permanent sounding board, a professional sounding board for a reality check, also for these ideas. And maybe sometimes I come with new ideas for them as well, of course. And we have a great relationship, and it's but so the amount of added value is just so much increased.
I think that's a really good segue actually into your career in journalism, because that's obviously why we wanted to hear from you here, because being simultaneously an expert in the space but also having to tell a different kind of narrative. So you've told the narrative to your clients or your underwriters as a broker, but how do you tell the story of reinsurance, and how's that story changed over time, I guess, as well?
I suppose there's a difference between what I'm doing now and what the Insurance Insider was doing. And so there's a difference between sort of what you'd broadly call it feature journalism and news journalism. News journalism was great. It was just like being a broker, because it's real cuss and thrust. It's about, there's some information out there, how am I going to get it? So how would I get this great story on the history of Superseed or something? Yeah. What if you all split up? And we're talking about in 5 years' time, acrimoniously. I could get, if I want to find out about what Jared's doing, I ask Ben. I don't ask Jared. I can't. And so it's like being a broker of information. So it's I want to find out about you. I ask all your friends and your former friends, and some people who are not your friends, but people who know you well, or people you've interacted with, all those underwriters. And I'll try and find out what you're doing from that, or your investment banker, your now former investment banker. That was the absolute fun, but it's all off the record. And basically I come and I find out that you're buying this broker in France. That's the story. And I phone you up, Ben. I say, you're buying a broker in France, blah, blah, blah. We're going to run the story tomorrow. What do you got to say for yourself? No comment, right? Or whatever it is. And that's great fun. It's really exciting. And you always, you're sort of on the edge. What I'm doing now is completely different, because you can't suddenly come and doorstep someone. You have to find a way of making them comfortable to talk about things, and you're trying to get them to talk about things that perhaps they don't want to talk about, but everyone wants them to talk about. Something, I know this merger, or something bad that happened, or the lessons learned from it, etc. And it surprises me that you have to be completely opposite. You've got to be transparent. If I get someone on the podcast, I tell them very quickly what I want to talk about. What are the 20 questions? They've got time. And what's really surprised me is that they would, if you give them time to talk about something, to prepare, to know it's coming, whereas the news journalism, you don't give them any clue. They have no idea what's happening. You keep them totally in the dark. Otherwise, they're going to close you down. And they could, obviously, they can steal your story by running a press release, ahead of time, and you go, or leak it to someone else if they really don't like you. I mean, it can be really quite nasty. Yeah. But with a podcast, a feature, something's out in the open, it is softer. But it's funny that there's a harder edge to the softness, if you see what I mean. Because if I'm asking you about that really difficult question, and everyone knows that they need to probably address this question, and they've got time to prepare, it surprised me that you will get people to talk about quite difficult things without, that they can talk about them. They've got time to talk about them, and they don't mind talking about them, oddly enough, as long as they're not suddenly doorstepped and suddenly, sort of taken by surprise about it. Because obviously you can't have a podcast where people are saying, oh, well, I can't possibly talk about that. It's like, well, that's not going to be a very good podcast. Yeah. So what can we talk about? We'll talk about the things we can talk about. And then you get into a lot of detail with things again, and then, you'll find out what something isn't, and then you find out what it really is, because you have my kind of everyone's kind of impression of what it is from outside, not knowing what it really is, and then you'll be corrected, and you'll get to somewhere much more interesting, much more nuanced, and then it opens up. Usually, I do 20 questions beforehand, but of course, as soon as they open their mouths, because I don't know what they're going to say. So then you have to listen to them and react, and then you can go somewhere much more interesting, and you end up talking about stuff that's not on the list of 20 questions.
Do you have a guest, obviously besides us, that stands out as sort of the most interesting conversation, or the one that took a sort of deviation that you found more fascinating than
well, it's people who are absolutely themselves. The best downloaded and the most downloaded podcast is a guy called Clive Washburn. He's a marine legend, but I didn't know him. I didn't do a lot of marine back in the day, but he's someone that, as a journalist, you'd sort of, when he moved from one underwriting shop to another, it was a news story because he moved millions of premium with him. It was a big deal. People were talking about it, so you knew it was important. And he recently started up on his own. One of the sort of Fidelis MGA, what's it called, Pine Walk, and it's called Navium. His business, his unit within that, and you meet someone who's known to be a legend, and of course, and the first thing I said, well, why do you start Navium? And he said, well, Mark, I was thinking about it last night, and it's because of ego, really. It's like throw all the questions out the window. It's like this is great. This is just great. So people really surprise you.
Yeah.
You have no idea what they're going to say. You would assume that we would have some pre-prepared thing about it, the sort of spiel you'd read on his website. But no, he's like, no, I'm just going to be really honest and open, and that tells you far more about why people like Clive Washburn.
Yeah.
And that's why brokers come back to him and they show him business all the time, and that's why he's able to pick and choose. He probably gets the best showing because people just probably enjoy talking to him.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it, certainly.
Well, and it shows an interesting parallel as well from your background, doing some of the hard reporting, pulling out stories that people probably didn't want to go out, but still salvaging the relationships to such a point where everyone's come on your podcast. Like across the industry, there are very few people who people would want to hear from that I don't think you've already talked to, right? So how have you thought about that transition, or even when you're a journalist, managing that sort of keeping the relationship close, but sort of going, I'm gonna tell the truth on this thing, and I don't think you're doing
it's
this
difficult,
well.
but it's much easier now because I don't have a commercial relationship with anyone. Whereas before, the Insurance Insider was a subscription business model. So you end up with, biggest broker in the world might have a corporate license worth hundreds of thousands for all of their employees to get the Insurance Insider on their intranet or whatever it is. And then suddenly you don't want that to ever be a factor in you running a negative story about that business. And so with me, actually, doing it on the podcast is great because I've removed that conflict because I only take money from service providers. And that's probably a bit of a sad moment when I'm talking to my bank manager about I could have taken some money from Aon, Marsh or whoever, but actually I don't want to, and I don't need to. So there's so many great service providers out there who would like to support it, and they've got services to explain and to sell to the industry that I don't need to. So I don't have to be conflicted to worry about, oh my God, I've just written this thing about Aon and, it's going to be okay till lunchtime, but then they're going to wake up. And will Chicago wake up in a bad mood because I've written something about them or not?
Yeah.
And then will they suddenly pull, they've got the CEO booked in for this conference in the autumn, and they're going to be the headline speaker. And so what if they suddenly say, oh, sorry, I'm not doing it anymore because I don't like you? So I don't have to worry about that. Yeah. But it was much harder. It was harder in the day because obviously, what are people buying with the Insider? They're buying that total honesty and that fearlessness to say, we'll run a story about, we have to run this story because this is what people are paying us to do. We're telling the truth about the industry and the truth that they don't necessarily want you to hear. But you end up with an inherent conflict if you've got those people who are spending a lot of money with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you don't want a conflicted priest taking those confessions.
No, absolutely. What if you're working for the devil as well?
Well, and the votes have come back in, and you did win our analogy battle. So we'll have to.
I've had more practice. All those years, having to write editorials and coming up with that. I was like, what? I used to say to all the junior reporters, I would do a little seminar about how to write because people really get. You can be a journalist. And you break stories, you get to know the industry really well, and then suddenly someone says, right, you're going to write the editorial, and suddenly they're totally terrified. Yeah. It's like, what do you mean? Am I supposed to have an opinion about this industry? It's like, yeah, you can now because you've been doing it for 5 years. Your job is to look at the industry, and most of the people in the industry haven't got time to look at the industry. That's why they buy the magazine, because actually you forget that you actually have a privileged position. That your job is to look at it, and then you might have a better chance of understanding it than most other people because they're too busy running around doing it to see the wood for the trees. So oddly enough, actually journalism, it's that part of journalism, but it's that transition to think, God, have I earned the right to actually have a view on this now? And you have to take a lot of work to convince perhaps a junior reporter who's got this assignment that you're going to write the editor's letter. Yeah. To say, but I would say, well, don't. One of the things about the analogy is, don't tell me what it is, but tell me what it's like. Make it more relatable, so that people can say, oh, it's like that. Okay, fine, yeah. Well,
that's kind of the angle we're taking on this podcast is to allow for an audience who might not be deep reinsurance professionals, but people who are kind of early in the industry, going through it, trying to understand and unpack what can be very, very detailed and complex issues and topics. So bringing it to a level that's digestible for people who aren't or in the space, as a full-time job,
So
sort of
you-
new to the space. It's really
It took me for years because I didn't really. It was when we got a new boss, and he'd been at Greg Fester, which is then became part of Benfield, and then it's now part of Aon, and they had a really good training manual.
yeah.
And he said, "Well, what if you're an insurance company? What do you do? How much risk do you take? You've got a pot of capital, then how much of it do you risk on any one single risk?" It's like 2%. I don't know, whatever. It's like I'd never thought of it like that until someone actually actively sort of tried to show me that, because I'd been too busy doing it to think about it, how it works.
Yeah.
And perhaps we didn't have that kind of training mentality. We had sort of, you'll pick it up type amateur slightly way of doing things. I think these days everyone, and the younger generation coming into the industry, is so much readier of one, they know about podcasts, and there's so many tools to. So I found a lot of people listen to the podcast have just come into the industry, and they'd say, "Mark, thanks for the podcast. It's great. It's given me a real kind of turbocharge into thinking like CEOs think." And I didn't know they thought like that, and I hadn't really thought about capital, and I didn't realize it's really about money, is it? I was thinking about it's about risks and about this and about getting things done, but actually, if you think more like them, it's like, oh wow, yeah, like am I going to get a return on my capital by doing this or by doing that? And could I get a better return doing it another way? So yeah, it takes a long time to get your head around it. And I think this is really helpful. And more stuff like this is going to help people get much faster into sort of that level of understanding you suddenly need. Where for me, it took about 4 years to suddenly have this light bulb moment.
Yeah.
Oh God, I'm putting business in, and then there's business coming out, and I've got to think about their reinsurance as much as the insurance I'm trying to get done. And because I hadn't really thought about it, I didn't know it was all connected. And suddenly I realized I could even get involved in solving that problem. And if I could do that, I could get the insurance. Then I could make twice as much brokerage. I had no idea,
Yeah.
Well, there you have it, folks. The place to go in between your weekly installments of the Reinsurance podcast is, of course, the Voice of Insurance podcast.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have to wrap it up there, sadly. But thank you, Mark. You've been a fantastic guest, and we've really enjoyed having you on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been, any chance, as you can see, any chance for me to talk,
Well, we always love chatting with you, so we get to record this one at least, so we can share that
No,
value.
but I am like this all the time. Really.
That's why I love it.
Except when I'm asleep.
Yeah. Cheers, Mark. Thanks so much.
Thanks.